All right. So I also wanted to talk about this. This is the average popularity ranking of all specs over the last 6 seasons. And the reason it's interesting to look at is to think about what may or may not be good in Dragonflight. A lot of people are looking at talent trees or things returning or things not returning, thinking that they can use that information to predict what's going to be good. But I think that's wrong. I think you just look historically at what's been good to decide. And so let's look at what's been good in the past. And normally I haven't been able to do this, but I've played all these seasons, so we can actually talk about this. So first, let's just go down the list from top to bottom. This is from a site, M+ Subcreation. And yeah, this is just taking all the data and saying what's popular. So let's look at tanks first. There's going to be some very interesting numbers here. For instance, the most popular tank over the last 6 seasons. Yeah, maybe we zoom in a little bit. Maybe a 150. Boom. Okay, there we go. So let's look at tanks. Historically, what's been going on with tanks? One thing I'll say is I feel like the fan favorite tanks are Brewmaster Monk and Prot Pally. I don't think either of these tanks has ever been like a rank 1 tank, like the #1 tank in any of the seasons that I can remember. Like Prot Pally's competed. It was really good in season 2 with this X-Pack, I guess. But I think Prot Pally and Brewmaster Monk are very, very popular choices. And it's usually, both of them are consistently like pretty good. So I think, generally speaking, those are tanks, not to call them safe, but they seem to be usually decent. They seem to be pretty decent almost all the time. Like, there are people who are just one-trick brews that only play brew ever, and usually they can do high keys. And I don't know so much about Prot Paladin, but, yeah, I don't think there's as many one-trick Prot Paladins, but there are some. So the #1 tank, besides those two, now we have Prot Warrior. Prot Warrior is very, very biased, and it's hard to understand this data because all through BFA it was the best tank, except for maybe season 1. And then all through Shadowlands, it was total beans. Basically, Prot Warrior was amazing, especially going into season 4. And then in Shadowlands, they moved around the talents, they disabled like builds that people used, and now it was not good. I feel like Prot Warrior does end up kind of being a one-dimensional tank in that it's like very, very good versus physical damage. If it does damage, it does damage. I'm surprised to show that it's still no, I guess I'm not that surprised that it's not super popular. So yeah, I think Prot Warrior, historically at least, this is a tank that's either very good or very bad. Spell Reflect was also very, very big. Then we have Guardian Druid. I feel like Guardian Druid has sort of been the same spot through all of this. It was a little better in Shadowlands. It was a little worse in BFA. But for the most part, Guardian Druid is always like decent and easy, but like not super good. Like never, in my opinion, was there a point where Bear was the best tank. I think season 2, it was pretty good. Like season 1 and season 2, it was pretty good. But I feel like Bear is kind of like the easy tank. Like if you want to play a tank that's just like simple and you just like, you know, mash your buttons and it's not super complicated. A lot of people seem like they're optimistic about the Bear tree in Shadowlands, but historically Bear's been kind of like good, but like okay, easy, like good tank, but not ever like super, super good. And lately it's been pretty beans. It fell off real hard when tier sets came out because the tier set was not good. Vengeance. I feel like Vengeance from a healer's point of view is like always the most misplayed tank. Vengeance always seems like it has the least uptime on its stuff, except for like current season on big trash pulls. Maybe I just see that every single Vengeance is just a Havoc Demon Hunter reroll that can't get into keys. So like Havoc was decent in BFA, so no one played it, but now that Havoc got bad in Shadowlands, everyone started playing Vengeance, is sort of how it seems. I think Vengeance is a tank where, I don't know, you probably either love it or hate it. In terms of it being best, I don't even know if it was, like, it was pretty good in season 1, but you still just had to run around. Like, it was just like the best tank at running around during the fabled kiting meta. And then there's Blood DK, which is actually kind of crazy. Blood DK has been so bad for so long. What's funny is BFA, so we don't have Legion and we don't have BFA Season 1, but Blood DK being the worst tank is like sort of a sample size bias here because BFA Season 1, Blood DK was the best tank, if I remember. And in Legion, Blood DK was like one of the best tanks. So if you added BFA Season 1 in Legion, Blood DK would go stonks, rising right up on this list, I think. Blood DK also is just fun A lot of people enjoy playing Blood DK. If you want a tank that's fun and that like you have more control over your health, this is like a tank that you play. This is like kind of like the pug carrier tank too, I think. If you're just a good player and you're just trying to like either do carries or help your friends or just like pug and ignore everybody, I feel like Blood DK is a good tank for that. So I think even though Blood DK is low on this list, probably Vengeance should be the bottom. It should be like Vengeance, Bear, and then probably Blood DK within somewhere in here. Yeah, that pretty much goes over the tanks. I think Brew and Prop Paladin, I hate using the word safe, but Brew and Prop Paladin are pretty safe, like usually decent. I think Guardian Druid and Vengeance are probably two of the worst tanks, but Guardian Druid is like usually simple to play, so I don't think it's necessarily that bad of a pick and is good sometimes. Has more stuff that you can help your team with in pugs. And then Blood DK and Prot Warrior are kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to call them specialists, but they kind of like are good at specific things. The thing about Blood DK is it's always pretty self-survivable. Like even when Blood DK was not popular in these seasons, you could still survive pretty well on Blood DK. I mean, BFA season 4, like we would do Blood DK keys. Dorky would play Blood DK and Toldagor and other keys if they were homework keys. Blood DK could live. You just worry about getting global and you worry about your damage. Like the problem with Blood DK through all BFA was a lot of it was just its damage. And yeah, with the tier set, this was the first time Blood DK does damage. So basically, if Blood DK does damage, it's like a very high tier tank, and if it doesn't do damage, then it's probably not going to be very popular. One thing we hope is that they make threat better. Part of the reason that Blood DK was not popular too was that when you don't do damage because threat's been so tough, you actually don't get, like, you can't keep threat on mobs, and you can't gather mobs and keep threat on mobs when people are blasting. So I think if they fix threat, even the lower damage tanks wouldn't feel so bad, but with threat being as difficult of a mechanic it is, playing a tank that does no damage feels really, really bad. All right, healers. I think there's like zero surprise here. Zero surprise here with the healer situation. So the two best healers are Holy Paladin and Resto Druid over the last two expansions. Resto Druid dominated BFA with Holy Paladin closely behind. Arguably, Holy Paladin was overtaking Druid by the end of the expansion. Then going into Shadowlands, Druid kind of fell off, but it was always kind of like okay, while Holy Paladin kind of took over. Now we're kind of in the Holy Priest meta, but as you see, if we look at a healer like Holy Priest is dog water, and then all of a sudden it gets a Holy Priest and Blood DK were like pretty similar, right? They're pretty one-dimensional. They do what they do pretty well, but don't, like, if they get buffed and they do a lot of damage, then they're crazy good, right? They're crazy good if they can do a lot of damage. A lot of people were playing Holy Priest all through this time, like it was a very unpopular healer, but as soon as it does damage, that's when you see it exist in high keys. So if you're just getting into WoW right now and you're seeing, oh wow, Holy Priest is really good, I think actually Holy Priest is not a very safe pick because it's historically been really bad and it's probably going to get tuned down for Dragonflight. I assume Holy Priest is going to end up in the gutter and be a non-popular healer again in Dragonflight, but we'll see. So then Resto Shaman. So Resto Shaman, they made Bloodlust worse from BFA Season 4 to Shadowlands. Or sorry, not Bloodlust, but Drums. They made Drums worse, so they made having a Natty Lust better. So we saw more Resto Shamans being picked up in Shadowlands. In Pugs, at least, just because you get Lust. Having a Kick is also very nice. In a higher level setting, though, I don't think the Kick or the Lust is usually that useful. There's almost always like one meta Lust class, and you usually don't have a shortage in kicks when you're a very organized group. Shaman right now is a great healer for Pugs, but probably not like S tier. Hard to say where Shaman will be. I feel like it's going to continue down that path of where it is in Shadowlands, if I had to imagine. I really like the tree. I feel like Shaman has the most well-designed tree so far of the healers that I've seen. And if they keep Lust in the way it is, the one thing that's nice though is these other classes are going to get kicks now, right? So Holy Paladin is going to have a kick. Resto Druid's going to have a kick. Priest does not. So that's one point against Shaman is that you're not going to have, like, the interrupt is not going to be that special, but I think because it's a ranged interrupt and it's a 12-second cooldown, it's still going to be pretty good. Resto Shaman is like sort of the brewmaster, I guess, of healers right now, in that it's like usually pretty safe, pretty decent. It was not super popular in BFA, but you know, they've sort of changed how stuff works, and I assume it's going to continue working like that. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Shaman ends up being S tier as well, depending on tuning. So I think Shaman is definitely like one of this. I think like between these three are for sure the safer healers to pick. It's always possible for any Disc Priest, Mistweaver Monk, or Holy Priest to be good, but they have to be tuned well. Like they just need to be giga buffed. Mistweaver, Yeah, it's been in the gutter for some time. I'm actually surprised it was 4 through BFA. I guess it made sense because no one really played Priest in BFA. Disc Priest and Holy Priest were not popular at all in BFA, but they did get PI. So I think that does help them. To say that PI is the reason Priest is good right now is because of PI is total BS, right? Because in Season 1 they had PI and Holy Priest was 3rd popular, Disc Priest was 6. Season 2, 4, and 5, right? These were not meta healers all of Shadowlands. It was only until Holy Priest got buffed where it's doing big damage was, oh, now everyone says, oh, PI is OP, you know? And then now we have Evoker to think about too. Who knows what Evoker will do? I think, let's be honest, Evoker looks really fun and everybody who plays the healer is probably going to make an Evoker ult because it's going to be fun. Can't compare Season 1 and 2. Ashen was broken. Well, here's the thing, right? Here's sort of what I'm trying to get at with these lists. Like, basically there's classes that are safe, or sort of appear safe, at least based off the data. There's classes that are usually not popular, and then there are classes that get overtuned and were OP, right? Like, they're always, though. There's Prot Warrior, overtuned and OP, but now it actually, like, you know, isn't really that good. Blood DK, not really that good, now overtuned and OP. Holy Paladin was overtuned and OP early on in Shadowlands, but is, like, still consistently good. Holy Priest was overtuned right now, but was consistently not that good before. You know, and again, how much can we learn from this data? I don't know. It's at least interesting to look at. Okay, so now let's look at melee. We lost our color coding here when I tried to put everything into dark mode. I apologize, but there's not much we can do about it for now. You guys can use your imagination. Rogue is by far the absolute most safe DPS that you can play in Mythic Plus. Rogue has always been popular. There's almost always a Rogue spec in the meta comp. Rogue would need to get like nerfed into the ground because of how good of the utility that it brings for Mythic Plus. All the stops that it has, Shroud, it's so tanky. You have a cheat death, you have immunities. Like, Rogue is absolutely insane in its toolkit. And now Rogue is getting a raid buff, right? So Rogue is absolutely going to be nuts. Or not nuts, but it's always up there. So if you're looking to play a melee DPS and you want to play a melee DPS that's good, I think Rogue is a pretty safe bet. So actually up here is Windwalker Monk, which does make sense. Windwalker has been pretty consistently good. The problem is that Windwalker very often has like weird bugs or like problems with it and then falls off pretty hard. When you can afford to bring a melee DPS other than Rogue, Windwalker is really good. It sort of depends on dungeon design if you can. Well, to be fair, a lot of people were worried about Shadowlands being super melee unfriendly, and it hasn't been so bad, but Windwalker is sort of like not quite as utility as Outlaw Rogue, but Windwalker does need to do good damage. All right, Havoc. Havoc is kind of interesting because it's always pretty popular, but I don't really think Havoc has been that good for all of Shadowlands. I think Havoc is just a very popular class. There are lots of people that like playing Havoc, and there are lots of people that are just like Havoc one-tricks. I don't know exactly what that means. It's just a simple class to play. It has a cool sort of like fantasy or whatever, but I don't think Havoc really fits in with like Windwalker and Outlaw in terms of like how popular it's been. I will say though, with talent trees, I think it's pretty likely that Havoc gets some stuff, and I don't know, like I'm just interested to see what happens to the Havoc talent tree, because I just don't know what it's going to be. Is it going to be a straight line with 30 passives in a row? All my Havoc buddies have been complaining all expansion, so it's hard for me to say a lot of good stuff about Havoc, but throughout BFA, Havoc was really good and really popular. Havoc again is like sort of the third in this totem pole of like usefulness. You do have like an AoE stop. You're kind of tanky because you have Netherwalk. They lost some tankiness from BFA from not being able to like blade dance dodge stuff. I think they lost some of their leech too. So, you know, this is definitely like Outlaw Rogue for sure the most utility. Windwalker still has a lot, but not quite as much as Rogue. Havoc, a little bit less than Windwalker. I'm not going to talk about all the Rogue specs. In my opinion, if you play Rogue, you should just be willing to, like, I'm more talking about classes on this list than specs. So like Rogue, I put up here. Even if Ass Rogue or Sub Rogue isn't always that good, one of the Rogue specs will be good. Usually it's Outlaw, but historically it's been Sub a little bit this expansion too. Fury Warrior, I feel like Fury Warrior is like usually the highest DPS, or like one of the higher DPS melee specs. It just brings nothing. Having a DPS warrior on your team like just doesn't really, like, they don't have the utility that these other other classes above them bring. So Fury Warrior like needs to be tuned well in order for it to be like, you know, but I think that's sort of like, that's the class fantasy that you want as a warrior. Like, you want to be Zug Zug, you don't want to have to worry about your teammates. In theory, Fury Warrior should be doing more damage than like all of these specs, and historically it usually doesn't. That's kind of why you don't see it, but it's also like kind of popular. Unholy and Frost, sort of in that, I mean, pretty much Unholy, Frost, Enhance are all sort of in that same bucket of they just don't bring enough to groups compared to these classes, and so they just need to be doing huge damage in order to be brought. They may be doing huge damage, or they might not, and that just depends on tuning. So, you know, a class like Windwalker or Outlaw, chances are you can find your way and be useful in keys. Classes like these, still probably fun if that's what you're into, but they're not always tuned super well. Then you have Ret Paladin, Survival Hunter, and Feral Druid, which it's funny to put Survival down here, but Survival Hunter has been a complete meme spec and one of the least popular specs for all of Mythic Plus except for this season. And again, this is a tuning thing where unless, you know, this is what happens, right? If you're a spec and you start doing insane damage, okay, now you're brought, right? All it takes is a tuning patch where you're doing the most damage. The problem is historically is they just aren't really tuned to do a lot of damage. And it's kind of interesting to see these specs too, right? Because we were talking about how useful the utility that Survival Hunter has, right? It has Misdirect, it has Mortal Strike, Binding Shot's really good, it brings Lust. Like, we're talking about all the stuff that it brings, but no one cared about any of those things until it does infinite damage, right? And so the summary about classes in Mythic Plus is you just want it to do infinite damage. Like, you're not going to see a class in the meta unless it's doing infinite damage. That's just how the meta works. And so you can try and use these numbers and say like, well, usually Windwalker Monk does good damage, but all it takes is one patch where you don't, and now your class is 13, right? And all it takes is one patch for Feral Druid to do infinite damage with some bonus, and you get that, right? Yeah, well, Survival Hunter is a little bit different in terms of specs because their off specs are ranged, right? Like, as a rogue, you have 3 melee, like usually there are like melee DPS players and ranged DPS players, and like if you're playing rogue, you kind of play all the specs, whereas like usually you have like Boomkin mains and Feral mains, right? There aren't that many people that switch between those specs often. There are some, like obviously really good hunters like Gingy will play all the specs, but a lot of the Survival Hunters that I've seen this season are just melee rerolls, not people who normally play like BM or Survive or BM or Marks. So yeah, these specs historically not very good, but again, any spec can be number one. Any spec can be number one if it gets the right tuning. So into range specs. So the most popular spec in keys, surprisingly, is Ellie Shaman. And I saw this and I was like, huh? But then I kind of thought about it, and I think range DPS, because they don't quite have the utility that melee does, suffers from that, like, from patch to patch more than any other class does, right? Like, for example, Destrolock, right? Bad, bad, bad. Like, bad, bad, okay, bad, bad, number one, right? Like, that's basically how a lot of these specs are, right? Fire Mage, worse, number one, number two, bad, number two, you know? Like, these classes are either doing infinite damage or you're not bringing them because they don't really bring that much. And that's sort of how a lot of the range specs are, where at least in melee, classes like Rogue or Windwalker and sort of Havoc at least bring some like more special stuff, so that as long as their damage is okay, you kind of bring them. But you know, Ellie Shaman I think is the most, I don't know, is it the most versatile range? It's hard because they all bring different stuff. All of these specs that you see on top do have some cool stuff that they bring. Ellie Shaman has the short kick. I guess they had AG in BFA, but now they have Fae too. They do a decent amount of off healing. Ellie Shaman and Balance Druid are like pretty defensive. And then you have Fire Mage that has a lot of stops. Shadow Priest brings like weird special utility that is either very useful or very useless, with things like Mind Control and Mass Dispel and Disease Dispel. Like, either you're making a lot of use out of Shadow Priest utility or it's zero. Shadow Priest was also like not bad in BFA at all, and then they did like the rework in Shadowlands and it kind of fell off. So one thing to note here though is we have between Arcane, Frost, and Fire, Mage is up there, right? So if you combined all of the mage classes, all of the mage specs, well, you don't care about arcane, but here fire mage was 10, but frost is 4. And then here fire is here. Now fire is not popular in season 2, but frost was really popular, right? And here frost and fire are popular. I think out of all of the range specs, mage seems like the quote unquote safest. You know, if someone had to, when people ask me like, oh, what's a safe spec to play? I feel like in Mythic Plus, at least for melee, it's rogue. For range, it's mage, are sort of safe bets. Having multiple specs means that you're more likely to have one of your specs be meta. BM traditionally is pretty popular, and it usually is like okay. As a healer, personally, it doesn't really feel like BM does that much. Like BM doesn't really bring that much except for like damage usually, and it's pretty easy to play. So you usually see BM appear in keys often, but not always in like world first level keys unless it's Giga Strong. And yeah, Warlock, again, this list would change a little bit if we saw Legion, because Warlock was pretty good in Legion. Warlock traditionally, at least when I've played the last 2 expansions, has not been a class you bring in Mythic Plus. It's only now that Destrolock is Giga Strong that you see, and then again, right, all you go is not super popular, and then all of a sudden rank 1. The balance patches is strong. And then you have yeah, I mean, Arcane Mage and Aflock are just like, you know, the redheaded stepchild or whatever. Out of 3 DPS specs, they're usually the worst ones. This is, oh, sorry for the flashbang, maybe. Okay, so to quickly go over this too, so this is by class. Maybe we should have done this first instead of looking at by spec. So tanks, healers don't really change. Priest moves up slightly, but not really. Also, I feel like priest players, like, there's like holy mains and disc mains. There's not a lot of priests switch between them. Okay, so now looking at melee, right? So rogue is way far above beyond everything else now, right? When you combine the rogue specs. And then same with mage and range, right? Now, all of a sudden, mage becomes the second most popular DPS class. There's rogue, and then there's mage, and then Windwalker Havoc are like, and then BM or Hunter is actually number 4 as well too. So yeah, grouping mage and rogue show exactly how far ahead that these classes are. Just looking at, if you had to guess what the meta would be, very often the meta is some sort of rogue, some sort of mage, and then whatever healer, whatever tank is good, you know? And like a lot of times you can just pick and choose. Brew, rogue, mage, like holy paladin or resto druid or shaman is probably like a good comp, or at least like an okay comp in like every single patch. Are there any other cool like things on this sheet? Okay, yeah, so this is all DPS specs. This is just all DPS specs on the same sheet, which again, maybe this would have been the or no, this is specs. This is by class. This is probably one that's worth looking at for a bit too. Yeah. So this is all classes ranked. So Paladin, Warlock, DK, Warrior, Shadow Priest, Shaman, usually not that popular. Druid, I feel like Druid's always balance. Balance is usually pretty popular. Feral is not really that popular, but yeah. Rogue, Windwalker, Mage, very, very popular over the last 2 years. What is this? Oh, this is just breaking it down by expansion. So yeah, you know, again, warning, how much can we really gather from this? Can we really use this to predict what's going to be good in the next expansion? I don't know. It just is what it is, right? Like, people like to see this data anyway, just because, you know, it's interesting to talk about and guess and theory craft what might be good. In my opinion, the way that you should play WoW, to wrap this up, is like 1 or 2 different ways. Number 1, if you like a class and you vibe with that class, just play it, and just, you know, if it's not good, it's not good, you know? Enjoy the class that you play. Or be willing to reroll on a seasonal basis. It feels kind of bad, and it's like weird that people look down upon like meta rerollers or whatever, but playing a meta class and like being meta feels good. Like, it feels good to be powerful, it feels good to be invited, and it's personally the way I play, and it keeps stuff fresh too, because you're relearning new specs and new dungeon, like how to play that spec in the dungeon every single season. People ask why I don't get sick of doing the same dungeons every day. It's like, well, because I've learned how to heal these dungeons on Resto Shaman, Disc Priest, Holy Priest, and Holy Paladin this expansion. At one time or another, I was doing high keys on those classes.